This is a review of the 1969 TV movie Silent Night, Lonely Night, which is directed by Daniel Petrie, based on a play by one of my heroes, Robert Anderson. It's got a great cast. It stars Lloyd Bridges, Shirley Jones, Cloris Leachman, and a young Jeffrey Bridges in a couple flashback scenes. If you've been following this channel at all, you've noticed that I've been reviewing a lot of Robert Anderson movies. This is another one. He didn't really do that many movies, so we're going to run out before too long. Don't worry. But I'll get to why. I'll recapitulate some of the reasons why I'm such a fan. This movie is actually on YouTube. I have been trying to point that out more often when it is true, because often some of the movies I review on this channel are difficult to track down. And I have a huge process for finding various things in various places. But this one is easy. As of right now, at least, you can watch it on YouTube. That might not be true by the time you watch it, but a lot of television movies tend to actually find their way to YouTube and be there for a little while, and then they often sort of disappear, and they may come back again later. Sadly, it's a fairly dull VHS print of the film. It's possible that that's the best quality that the film is available in. It's possible if you buy a DVD, you'll get the same thing. The YouTube video for this movie has around 300,000 views. So people are definitely watched this. And to be honest, this is it's a pretty darn good movie that I would recommend, more or less. There's a lot of views. Sadly, there's not a lot of information about this movie out there on the internet. Kind of common for sort of these television movies or something like that. But at least some people are watching it. It's a shame that it's not better studied or something like that. But I hope to make some small contribution in that direction with this video. So, like I said, this is a TV movie, and it's a Christmas movie. I don't really watch TV movies. I don't really watch Christmas movies. But this movie really is quite up my alley because it's a grim humanist film. This is not some romantic, happy, holiday spirit, cheery, merry film. No, it's pretty much the opposite of all those things. A brutally realistic and introspective bout of psychological realism, like most of Robert Anderson's films. An incredibly mature picture surfacing uncertainty and asking some tough questions. It's possible this movie is more for middle-aged people, but we'll get more to that later. This was originally a play, and in some places it shows. The play was written, it debuted in 1959. Robert Anderson actually didn't write his first play till he was 33, which is kind of interesting. But it debuted in 1959, starring Henry Fonda and Barbara Bel Geddes originally. Henry Fonda, obviously, you probably know. Barbara Bel Geddes, not quite as well known, but a fairly famous actress on the stage, and was in some films as well, like she played Midge in Vertigo. The film came out in 1969. Now, a lot of stuff happened between 1959 and 1969, and you might wonder if the film lost some coherency or lost some sort of cultural significance in between then and when the play was, originally put on. And to some extent, that's possible. This movie does have perhaps some vestigial traditionalism, but it kind of just boils down to seeming like a very northeastern movie. This is set in Amherst, Massachusetts, and it was filmed there. 2, it's a very NESCAC sort of film. It's a very northeastern affair, and if there is some kind of datedness to it from 59 to 69, you more or less just get washed up into this like slightly elite northeastern, somewhat out of touch culture. And it's possible that things in Amherst, Massachusetts are somewhat similar today anyway, in some degrees. Perhaps they are. So it doesn't seem like there's too much of a slippage there. It's possible. It's actually interesting too, because there are a couple of younger characters in this film that actually seem like they might fit in better in 1969 than 1959, and you wonder if they were rewritten slightly for 1969. I'll get back to them shortly. Puffing is a term that I made up, I think, referring to when useless things are added to stage adaptations, movies that were made from plays, to prove that it's a movie and not a play. In this movie, for instance, there's a somewhat extensive snowmobile scene. This snowmobile scene, I think almost certainly was not in the original play. They probably didn't have snowmobiles on stage. It's really not needed in the movie either, but it does give you the idea, hey, look, it's a movie, not a play. The movie suffers from this a little bit. This also is very clearly a television movie, especially in the first third. It is kind of, it smells like a TV movie without a doubt. But ultimately, that doesn't hold it back too much. There is some kind of interesting style in this, especially in the beginning. There's a somewhat edgy style around here. From 1969, it's actually not too uncommon for the TV movies that I've seen, at least, to be somewhat stylish. Usually the style is not kind of the cutting edge. It's maybe a couple years out of date. But if anything, TV movies tend to suffer from not enough subtlety rather than too much. So there is some kind of interesting stylistic things in this movie. Onto the plot. I'm not going to spoil much here, but I'll give you a bit of an idea of what happens. So this movie is really about a brief encounter between two middle-aged people, John and Catherine, right? Lloyd Bridges, Shirley Jones. It's on Christmas or Christmas Eve. I can't remember, to be honest. They're both down a bit. They've both come to Amherst under somewhat not exactly unexpected, but under somewhat not really grim, not really depressed, but under somewhat downbeat circumstances. Let's put it that way. John, for instance, comes because his wife is in a mental institution in Amherst. And he has actually just gotten an annulment to separate himself from his wife. Apparently, the idea was to ease some burden of guilt from her. It was apparently her idea, suggested in one of her more lucid moments, was that they should be separated so she doesn't hold him back or something like that. An annulment perhaps out of love from both parties. It's not clear how realistic the wife's condition is. Despite being a central piece of the plot, she's not a main part of the movie, and there's not a lot of detail about her condition, which more or less ends up being fine in the movie, but it is slightly vague at times. This is another one of the things that holds back the beginning a little bit, is just understanding exactly what's going on there. Catherine's son goes to school in Amherst, not to college, but some kind of prep school. Not surprising that you might find one in and around the area. He's about to head to London to meet up with his father, and Catherine is not going to go with them for reasons that will be revealed. So she is a bit downbeat as well, both of them having had their marriages shaken to some extent. They ease towards each other. You know, they're both staying in the same inn or lodge or whatever it's called. Not a lot to do in Amherst when you're alone on Christmas Eve. And they kind of inevitably are pulled towards each other to some extent. They open up to each other slowly. They open up, finding intimacy and perhaps finding ways to understand their situation and their circumstances and to make peace with the twists of their life. This is not an extremely fast-paced movie. Like I said, the first act smells like a TV movie. But there is consistent emotional tension which builds, particularly through kind of the second third of the film. And when you get to the third act, the movie actually really is quite good, I would say. The third act is dynamic. It's conclusive. It has a fitting ending, but it also takes things in a different direction than what you might expect. It's a powerful film in the end. Surprised me by how good this movie was at the end of the day. It's clearly a Robert Anderson kind of movie. Clearly, we'll get into that a little bit more. But this is a pretty good movie that I would recommend. It does get a lot better as it goes on, though, like I said. So there's some obvious themes in this movie. You've probably picked up on them already. Marriage, matrimony, marriage as the institution. These are somewhat common themes for Robert Anderson, but not in his sort of film work as much as in his theatrical work or in some of his TV movies or whatever. In classic Hollywood, marriage is the end of the story, right? Couple formation is the name of the game. The movie ends when the couple is formed. They ride off together into the sunset or something like that. Everything is wrapped up. The pieces are where they should be or something like that. The puzzle's complete, right? You get the idea. Here we've got a movie about what happens once you've gone down the road a bit and some things have gone wrong, or maybe once things have been going wrong for years, which is probably very common. It's an interesting question about what percent of people are actually happy in their marriage out in the world, or even among the married people that you know. Clearly, it's not all sunshine and rainbows, but there are still potentially virtues that come from commitment and lasting, deep relationships. Complicated questions. I should also add the brief disclaimer that I am not currently, nor have I ever been married to anyone. And to some extent, this might, like I said, might be a film more for middle-aged people than for me. But some of these themes are pretty clear, and you don't need to be married necessarily to understand them, without a doubt. Things going wrong, common. There being challenges and struggles, common. I mean, divorces, common, really. So what do we make of the institution? in light of all this? It's hard to know. There's a lot of things at play here. We've done a lot of reviews of Robert Anderson here, and I think I say basically the same thing every time, which is that for me, one of the foremost virtues of his work is the way they foreground uncertainty in our life, right? And uncertainty, to some extent, is the answer to some of these things, is that there is a lot of uncertainty in this. Perhaps that's ironic. What should be a lifelong commitment? What should be an obvious, unceasing bond or something like that? What's certainly marketed that way is also something that produces a huge amount of uncertainty. Interesting. The annulment is an interesting idea. An annulment is not the same thing as a divorce, right? An annulment is kind of is an act of time travel to go back and to suggest that the marriage, in fact, never happened. Like I said, John is in favor of an annulment. He does this for the sake of his wife, and she seemingly does it for the sake of him. It's not clear that either of them are in favor of it exactly. You learn maybe a little bit more as things go on. But like I said, it's a strange manipulation. It reveals another idea in this movie, which is the passage of time, right? You can't go back and undo it, right? You could get a divorce, but you can't go back and wipe away the things that have happened. That's completely impossible. And this movie is partly stuck in the past. It's partly a reflection. It's partly backwards looking, pensive about the long arm of the past. There's a song I really like called Fountain of Sorrow by Jackson Browne that has a great line that's something along the lines of, while the future is there for anyone to change, sometimes it might seem easier to change the past, right? What an interesting idea. The future is open for anyone to change, sure, but often it seems easier for us not to set how things will go, not to change our fate, not to get onto a different track than we're currently on, but in fact, to look back and think about things differently, to lie to ourselves, to rewrite our lives and our history, to forget certain things and bring other things to the forefront under dubious significance and circumstances, right? It might be easier to change the past. Of course, a big idea in marriage is commitment, isn't it, right? Perhaps it requires taking a certain view of the past to perpetuate the future. Perhaps it requires a bit of narrative creativity to interpret previous events in a certain way to make the future ones feasible and sustainable. It's interesting. In marriage, it could be very clear that it's the future that is set and it's the past that's not. Interesting. In this movie, both characters face shaken commitments. They both have potentially valid reasons to not be committed. And their relationship with each other, right? They meet up in Amherst. They meet up at the inn, and their relationship with each other represents a lack of commitment, essentially. It represents unfaithfulness, essentially. And it's a rational case for it. Where the classic Hollywood movie ends with the intoxicating romance of the marriage, here we have a rational case for ending things. But somewhat beautifully, alongside this, there's a case for not ending things. And I'm not going to tell you how things go on. Later in the movie, you meet some younger characters. These are the ones that I was saying they kind of seem to fit with the 60s. One of the things they suggest is that marriage perhaps is antiquated and unnecessary, right? They ask, if two people really love each other, why need they be married? Why can't they just live together? And if it turns out that later on, things should, their interests and their personalities, their lives should diverge, what's wrong with that? Why shouldn't they move apart? It's a tricky question for older characters. It breaks up the equilibrium to some extent. And neither John nor Catherine know what to say to this, right? Like I said, uncertainty. It's one of the cardinal virtues of Robert Anderson. Here we get a long, tormented story about marriage, question about marriage, about the commitment, about the deep virtues, but also the profound uncertainties. And we come out of it not entirely sure how things should go, or what we should maybe learn from it. At the same time, what a true movie this seems to be. So that's Silent Night, Lonely Night. Like I said, TV Christmas movie, but it's absolutely not your average TV Christmas movie. It's a Robert Anderson TV Christmas movie, a mature, touching, and pretty powerful film that, generally speaking, I would recommend. It's got a pretty good cast. It's got pretty good acting. Music is okay. Like I said, it seems like a TV movie, but you can more or less, you more or less don't get too distracted by that. And as you'll see if you go to the YouTube video and see some of the comments, it seems like this is a movie that has resonated with people, and perhaps on a different level completely than some of your traditional romantic Christmas films. So that's Silent Night, Lonely Night from 1969, a movie that I would recommend you check out, especially while it's here, easy to watch on YouTube.